In this room. Good evening. I'm Rachel Marston, the Associate Director of the Literary Arts Institute at the College of St. Benedict. Welcome to tonight's event, a reading and talk by the author Diane Wilson. And wow, what a fabulous crowd. First, an apology. We were working to have auto transcription for closed captions happen, and we ran into technical difficulties. So Diane will read as clearly and loudly as she can into the microphone. The event is being recorded, and transcription and closed caption will be available on the recording when that's up via Digital Commons. But again, our apologies for not having that option available this evening. This event is organized in coordination with the Multicultural Center and the 25th Annual Festival of Cultures on campus. Today is also First Generation Student Day, so I would like to welcome Senior Jervon Sands to the stage to talk about that.
Good evening, everyone. So just a little bit of background for First Gen Day. So first, being a First Gen student means that your parents or legal guardians never attended a four-year college in the US. And today is National First Gen Day, and so we're celebrating that on campus. We had tabling earlier today, gave out some shirts, and we also launched our Triple Alpha First Gen Honor Society. You can find the application for that on the CSBSJU website. Along with the full FOC schedule, because it's our third FOC event, and we have a lot more throughout this week, culminating with our student showcase on Saturday. Thank you. I will now be reading our land acknowledgement to get us started. I'd like to acknowledge that both the College of St. Benedict and St. John's University occupy the original homelands of the Dakota and Anishinaabe peoples. We honor, respect, and acknowledge the indigenous peoples forcibly removed from this territory whose connection remains today. St. Benedict's Monastery and St. John's Abbey previously operated boarding schools for Native children. Now, students, faculty, and staff are working to repair relationships with our Native Nation neighbors. Thank you.
A few reminders. There will be time for questions following Diane's presentation. Her books are also for sale at the back of the room, and she will be available to sign books following the Q&A. Please silence your cell phones or other devices if you have not yet done so. Diane Wilson is the award-winning author of 4 books as well as essays in numerous publications. Her first picture book, Where We Come From, co-written with John Coy, Soon Yun Shin, and Shannon Gibney, was released in October of 2022. Her novel, The Seed Keeper, published in 2021, won the 2022 Minnesota Book Award in fiction. She has received other fellowships and awards from such organizations as the Bush Foundation, the Jerome Foundation, and the Minnesota State Arts Board. Wilson is the former executive director for Dream of Wild Health, an indigenous nonprofit farm, and the Native American Food Sovereignty Alliance, a national coalition of tribes and organizations working to create sovereign food systems for Native people. Wilson is a Metawakanton descendant enrolled on the Rosebud Reservation. Of the many ways I could approach talking about Diane Wilson's work, one would be about the powers of story and storytelling, how the stories we tell and the ways in which we tell them has a material impact on the world. Another would be to examine the care she takes in rendering the sensory details of the world in her work, such as in this passage toward the end of The Seed Keeper. The white blooms of spring trillium brightened the edges of the clearing. From a high branch of the oak tree behind the cabin came the flute-like song of a wood thrush. But a concern at the heart of her writing is the relationship of humans to the earth, in particular, our relationship to seeds and the food we grow and eat or the distance we have from this process. Her novel begins with a poem spoken by the seeds. The seeds trace their history and the emergence of humans into the world, how, as Wilson writes, we surrendered our wildness to live in partnership with the humans. But humans forget about this agreement. The seeds then bide their time through the long silence, a drought of memory, a time of darkness, as they wait for humans to remember. The relationship of seeds to memory is integral to the seed keeper. The seeds serve as a connection between the past and present in ways both literal and metaphorical. The seeds are Rosalie Ironwing Meister's heritage, though she does not yet know this. As readers, we see how seeds and the act of gardening create connections between Rosalie and her family history. The novel includes multiple narrators and chronologies in the book, one of which is a story of Rosalie's great-great-grandmother, Marie Blackbird, who was a young woman at the time of the U.S.-Dakota War. Marie works with her mother to bury their saved seeds as they flee for safety after being forced from their home. Rosalie only learns this history after discovering that her great-aunt, Darlene Killsdeer, is alive, and through Darlene and other elders in the community, begins to understand her mother's death and the long-lasting impact and trauma on her family of Native boarding schools and forced removal from their land. Rosalie's identity, much like the dormant seed, begins to awaken as the stories emerge. And just as the corn seeds her Aunt Darlene passes on to her carry stories of their own. Rosalie realizes that these seeds were, quote, saved by generations of women who believed their work was essential to their family's survival, not just as food, but as an expression of who they were. The growing of the garden does not go as Rosalie hopes, and she again faces loss, pain, and uncertainty. What happens to the garden, which I will let you discover in your own reading of the book, ultimately serves as a reminder of, as Wilson writes, the eternal cycle of birth and rebirth, moving from one body to another, and the essential connection that we have to each other and to the earth. As the poem which closes the book reminds us, love the seeds as you love your children, and the people will survive. Please join me in welcoming Diane Wilson.
Hamatakiapi, Ampetukinde Iushkian Wachian Kapia, Diane Wilson Namakiapia, Bide Wakantuan Oyate Hamatahaya, Sichangu Oyate Ed Omawapia. So hello, all my relatives, so many of you here tonight. It's really good to see you all. And my name is Diane Wilson. I'm a descendant of the Bide Wakantuan Oyate here in Minnesota, and I'm enrolled in Rosebud Reservation in South Dakota. And, you know, I had this big fear before tonight that the election and the rain would just keep people home. So I want to thank all of you for coming out and just sharing a little time when we can step out of the fray that politics is going to unleash or has already unleashed on us. So before I begin, I really would like to thank some people, starting with the Literary Arts Institute for the invitation to be here for this wonderful visit, and to Rachel Marston for her masterful organizing and very kind touring around. And I want to thank all the people who have provided meals for me during this stay and also given me rides, and the people that invited me into their classes, and the students who shared their questions so generously and then tolerated my questions. So I want to thank all of you for just the kind and generous hospitality that I have felt here on this campus. This has been a really special visit. So I wanted to share a very quick story from my time yesterday when I was with Rachel, and she took me over to the pottery studio, which was, I love pottery, and so it was really special to have tea with the potters and Augustin and another couple. And so while I was there, I decided to buy a teapot that had just come out of the kiln. And so Daniel said he needed to do some cleaning on it, so I left it and came back this afternoon to pick it up. And so he had it nicely wrapped inside a Rush River ale box. And so it's good for traveling. So it wasn't until I was dropped off at the Abbey and I was standing out there with my 12-pack of Rush River Ale that I thought, is this good that I'm walking into the Abbey with this box? So if you hear rumors, remember it was just a teapot. But that was very special to visit the pottery studio. So tonight, I would like to just talk to you about my work. I've been talking to different classes. I have to say that this was kind of set up as kind of a dream visit, that I was able to visit creative writing and Native studies and also environmental studies and have just really inspiring conversations with students from all of those different studies. And that for me is just so gratifying as a writer, because those are all areas that I are at really part of my heart. So I want to thank, it's probably Rachel, I'm sure you had a lot to do with that, but I just want to say that this has been a really just a blessed visit to spend time on this campus. But I'm going to share a little more of my story, my journey as a writer. And one of the things I think about a lot is telling true stories. And especially having written my first novel, it is a question, and it's been a question through all of the books that I've written, because I've moved across genres from memoir to fiction. And how we understand truth is really complicated. So I've been thinking about this quite a bit in preparation for tonight. So I want to share my journey with you through some of the writing that I've done. So and the ways in which we create stories that actually reflect a writer's unique truth. Because I do believe that we all come from stories that shape and define who we are. And I like to quote Thomas King, who's written, "The truth about stories is that that's all we are." So, as a Dakota writer, I'm descended from people who were originally oral storytellers. And Dakota writer Teresa Peterson explained in her book, Voices from Pajute Zizi, that the Dakota told two kinds of stories. The Wicho-Oyake contain a people's history, migrations, and genealogy, while Hitunkankapi are myths and legends. The role of the storyteller was to remember and pass down stories that preserve our history and culture, that teach our values and lessons, and entertain. In many ways, this is similar to contemporary genres of history, memoir, and fiction. Where they differ is in the community-based focus on ensuring the survival of Dakota people and culture through story. I think of my own work as written stories that also preserve history and culture, while reflecting on our contemporary experience of assimilation, especially with regard to teachings embedded in our traditional stories. My first book was a memoir, Spirit Car, Journey to a Dakota Past, that focused on the impact that assimilation has on cultural identity as it moves across generations. My second book was nonfiction, Beloved Child, A Dakota Way of Life, that explored historical trauma through interviews with Native elders and the ways in which we can transform trauma into a better way of life for our children. And my most recent book, a novel, The Seed Keeper, asked the question of how we restore our indigenous knowledge and teachings with regard to our relationship with the earth. As my books have evolved and reached more deeply into questions of cultural recovery, my life has also evolved as I internalize the knowledge that a writing practice can discover and reveal about the stories we carry. As storyteller Ben Okri has written, "In a fractured age, when cynicism is God, here is a possible heresy. We live by stories, we also live in them. One way or another, we are living the stories planted in us early or along the way, or we are also living the stories we planted, knowingly or unknowingly, in ourselves. We live stories that either give our lives meaning or negate it with meaninglessness. If we change the stories we live by, quite possibly we change our lives. And to that, I would add, quite possibly we change the world." What is it then that allows a book to convey the kind of truth that resonates across time and across communities? What message, what story rises up to capture an essential zeitgeist of our times, as happened with The Overstory by Richard Powers, or Beloved by Toni Morrison, or The Night Watchman by Louise Erdrich? How do we define truth in a world as rich and varied as literature? Perhaps stories travel by wind, searching for the right vessel, the hollow bone, whose craft is ready to receive the gift. When we choose to receive it, then we're also committing our intellect, our passion, our idealism, and our experience of the world to returning the gift as story for our communities. Perhaps the truth lies in the integrity of the process, the depth of the inquiry, and a reader's ability to perceive it. When I'm asked about the nature of truth in fiction, I feel compelled to speak to the nature of truth in genre as I have experienced it. I think of genre as a form that sets out the rules of engagement between the writer and the reader that define what we consider to be factually true. Each genre embraces, to different degrees, both the facts of our physical world as well as our lived experience, our imaginations, and our spiritual connection to our ancestors. Each genre has the potential for illuminating truth, for strengthening our shared humanity. And each genre has the potential for spreading untruths, for lying by omission, for allowing stories to be silenced. We create the world we live in through the stories we tell, as well as the stories we don't tell. My writing has been driven by questions, by a personal quest to know and understand a dimension of my life and my community that has not been addressed in the books that I read. What I've learned through this experience is that the soul of each story, its spirit, depends on the willingness of the writer to engage in the dual realms of physical reality and emotional truth. As Toni Morrison has written, the crucial distinction is not the difference between fact and fiction, but the distinction between fact and truth. My own story began in Minneapolis. growing up in a family where my father was of Swedish descent and my mother was enrolled on the Rosebud Reservation. She knew little about the history or intention around the boarding schools that she and her sisters attended, an experience that she was reluctant to talk about. In the predominantly white schools that I attended, I learned history that laid out the bare facts of treaties, of vanquished tribes displaced from homelands, of the inevitable march of civilization and progress across the country. These history books were presented as written by objective, anonymous historians, an account based in fact and on written records, irrefutable in their claims as proof of their conclusions. Even as a child, I knew these books could not explain my family's story. Not until many years later would I recognize the absence of a Native perspective in these histories, or that Native women had been almost completely erased from a written record that was kept primarily by white men with specific agendas. I had not realized then that there were so few books for children about Native leaders or history written by Native writers. Even today, the Cooperative Children's Book Center at the University of Wisconsin reports that only 1% of children's books published in the United States are written by Native and First Nations authors. Accepting the version of history I learned as a child might have been enough to keep me silenced had my mother not chosen to share a story from her boarding school experience. When I was a teenager, she told me that while she was living at the Holy Rosary Mission School on the Pine Ridge Reservation, that she had gone home to Rapid City where her family lived for a surprise visit. When she arrived, the house was empty. That's when she learned that her family had moved to Minneapolis looking for work. She returned to boarding school for another 2 years until her family could afford to send for her. In the few words she used to tell this story, her tone calm and matter of fact, I felt something shift from her life to mine. I drew it in like a breath, felt it attach in a way that would shape the direction of my life. This one story was the culmination of experience from generations in my family, just as a single seed contains the story of the land where it was grown. When my mother could not explain why she was left behind, the question became mine to answer. In writing the memoir inspired by my mother's story, I realized that we are taught, shaped, scarred, and strengthened by the stories we are told, the stories that we live, and the invisible legacies that help shape who we become. When these stories are silenced, as has happened to generations of Native people, when the history is ignored, then we are unconscious witnesses to the past. When a generation cannot reconcile their experiences, it becomes a legacy for their children and grandchildren who inherit the raw, unfinished work of their ancestors. As an adult, I followed my mother's story through the painful history of boarding schools, land allotment and reservations, blood quantum and intermarriage, retracing 5 generations back to the 1862 Dakota War in Minnesota. As I gathered all of the facts I could glean from the written record, I began rebuilding not only my family's history, but the Dakota history that was not taught in my school. I filled gaps in the record using intuitive anthropology, a technique taught by writer Leanne Howe to extrapolate missing stories from the written records. In a sense, these are spirit stories, written to recreate a history that has been lost over time or not told because it was too painful. Publishing the memoir Spirit Car was my way of speaking out against the silence that had repressed this history, our storytelling tradition, our spirituality, and our science. By insisting on telling our own true stories, together we can create a new collective history that is centered in diverse voices and differing experiences. Writing the memoir was an incredibly difficult craft challenge, especially for an inexperienced first-time book writer. As I am unencumbered by an advanced degree in literature, I simply followed the path, yes. How blessed I was. I simply followed the path where my curiosity and questions led me. I gathered interviews, traveled to reservations and boarding schools, spent long hours in the library doing research, fictionalized stories when the facts dried up, and wandered into magical realism. When my editor shook her head and wished me luck, I realized that I would have to invent a form to hold this story. Through many dead ends and failed attempts, I discovered that the secret to creating form comes from understanding the intention behind telling this specific story. Once I understood that my intention was to tell the story of how assimilation works across generations to impact cultural identity, I found a novel, Middlesex, that provided a form that would serve as my model. By studying Jeffrey Eugenides' craft, in particular how he wove timelines together, I realized that as writers, we can be mentored by books. One of the most important lessons I learned about craft came from a flamenco dancer, Susana de Palma, when she took on the daunting challenge of creating a text-free dance performance based on Lawrence Thornton's novel, Imagining Argentina. In the solitude of her dance studio, she would listen to music, study photographs, and imagine the experience of people during Argentina's dirty war in the 1970s. Then she would begin to move intuitively, feeling the emotions raised by the story expressed through her body. The next day, she worked with those intuitive movements as a choreographer, critiquing and perfecting the craft of her dance. From Susanna, I learned process, that as writers, we generate material in a raw first draft and then return to rewrite and rewrite until the craft expresses the emotional and intellectual heart of a story. Complex and difficult histories can be imagined as novels and reimagined as dance, as the original story ripples outward, carried by the creative work of artists and writers. Having written what was for me the true story of my family and Dakota community, I began asking a new question. What can I do with this history? Given the extensive suffering experienced by Native children over generations, it was difficult to not give in to despair. The news media, again a seemingly objective voice for facts, often focus on statistics that depict the struggles of Native families and communities with depression, alcoholism, violence, and poverty. The myth of objectivity screens from our view the subjective, culturally based lens that determines what becomes our news. As Nigerian-American novelist Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie has said, the problem with stereotypes is not that they are untrue, but that they are incomplete. They make one story become the only story. In stark contrast, Ella Cara Deloria's book, Water Lily, portrayed Dakota people as loving, kind parents who regarded their children as wahan, or sacred. By understanding the truth of boarding schools and assimilation programs, I could see how historical trauma formed the bridge between these two realities. That led me to the question that would become my second book, Beloved Child. How do we transform historical trauma into a better way of life for our children? Through interviews with Native elders, I was told that the past 500 years is a short time in the history of Indigenous peoples, which extends back thousands of years. And while it's important to understand this more recent past, it's even more important to focus on the genius and brilliance of Indigenous culture, philosophy, and science. The truth of our story lies in remembering what traditional storytellers knew, that we need to tell our own histories, to preserve our own cultural knowledge, and to pass on to future generations the myths and legends that hold our values and teachings. By doing so, we protect our culture as we enrich the world. Sun Yong-shin wrote in the preface to the anthology, A Good Time for the Truth, a society that systematically suppresses the story and wisdom of certain groups cannot make the best decisions for a shared future. In the long run, on our earth, we will thrive or fail together. As I worked on my first two books, I began to understand writing as a spiritual practice. I learned that simple rituals could invite the spirit of my story to enter the circle of my writing. And when I began working on The Seed Keeper, the practice of listening to the voices of my characters taught me that I was a hollow bone connected to our ancestors' stories. Writing fiction opened the door to understanding truth as intuition, blood memory, the collective unconscious, and the voices of our more than human relatives, and that the craft of fiction could be literally grounded in personal experience, community history, and visceral sensory observations of the world we live in. While I was researching the memoir, I heard about a collection of rare indigenous seeds that were being grown out by a tiny, bare-bones native program called Dream of Wild Health. As an avid gardener, I knew immediately that I needed to be with these seeds, that they were calling me to this work. I was fascinated by the stories these seeds were carrying: 800-year-old traditional tobacco, Cherokee Trail of Tears corn, and Hopi black turtle beans. These seeds carried stories of the seasons, of the ancestors who grew them, and the ancient wisdom of the mother plant herself. What I didn't know then was the long history these seeds carried, how close they had come to extinction, nor the important role played by women who had ensured their survival despite immense challenges. Working on Dream of Wild Health's 10-acre farm in Hugo, I was blessed to spend time with Native elders, farmers, youth and their families, and the seeds themselves. Each day was a slow unlearning of what I had been taught growing up in white schools. This process helped me see how the worldview that we are taught as children influences our daily lives, our relationship to the earth, and ultimately our work as writers. I discovered a book, Native Science, Natural Laws of Interdependence by Gregory Coyetti, that upended my understanding of the natural laws that create our physical world. He wrote, "The images we create, the languages we speak, the economics we manifest, the learning systems we espouse, and the spiritual, political, and social order we profess must all reflect and honor interdependence and sustainability." He explained that Native science, unlike the detached objectivity claimed by Western science, was based in a direct, experiential, and spiritual relationship with the earth. This dichotomy became one of the central themes in the novel, allowing me to explore the tensions created between individuals, between the land and humans, and between white and native communities. Coyote's book also helped me understand a fundamental philosophy of Dakota culture that is expressed through the saying, Mitakuye Owasi, that means we are all related. And when we say these words, we're claiming community for all beings, one that is built on respect and reciprocity and love. This understanding is rooted in the ancestral memories and stories that tell us human beings once held an original agreement with seeds, where we agreed to take care of each other. Seeds have collaborated with humans for thousands of years, allowing us to survive. Generations of families have saved and shared seeds to ensure the well-being of all. We broke our original agreement when we began to treat plants and animals, the land, the water, and our seeds as commodities that can be sold. When we honor that agreement once more, then we're remembering our original teachings. We remember how to honor the earth and all beings. As Robin Wall Kimmerer wrote in Braiding Sweetgrass, knowing that you love the earth changes you, activates you to defend and protect and celebrate. But when you feel that the earth loves you in return, that feeling transforms the relationship from a one-way street into a sacred bond. In other words, we become kin with everyone around us. This understanding of our ancient relationship with seeds formed the opening and closing poems that frame the story of the novel. For visceral details and a deeper understanding of indigenous gardens, I relied heavily on my experiences at Dream a Wild Health. We began each morning in a circle near the fields, all of us coming together for prayer before beginning the work of the day. Arapaho elder Ernie Whiteman opened each circle by saying, "Good Native American morning." And even the sleepy teenagers couldn't help but smile in return. We smudged to cleanse our spirits and offered tobacco with prayers in gratitude to the plants, soil, water, birds, and animals who shared this farm with us. Before we planted or harvested or shared a meal, we prayed in circle. And in this way, we learned that when we garden with reverence, then our food truly becomes our medicine. But the most important teachings came from the seeds themselves. When I held seeds in my hands that were planted hundreds of years earlier, I felt a connection that was timeless, that was not just the past or the future. Each seed contains within its thin shell the entire circle of time itself, an endless cycle of creation. As the call of blood memory reaches across generations, our bodies respond with an intuitive knowledge that is embedded in each cell. Our ancestors protected these seeds at all cost, knowing that they, like our children, are the future. And yet our seeds, like the earth, are currently facing a climate crisis and near extinction. Each day we're faced with news headlines filled with dire predictions about the threats to our survival as human beings. But if we look beyond the facts of these headlines, then I believe we will see instead that we are facing a crisis of relationship, where the community of care created through upholding Mitakuye Owasi has been dismantled and disregarded for the sake of profit. When we open our hearts to relationship with other beings, then we're also opening our hearts to grief for the loss of so many exquisitely beautiful, tender lives that have been sacrificed for our convenience. As writers, how do we respond to such grief? What actions can we take when the issues we face are global in their immensity? How can one person or one book make a difference? These are the questions that I struggle with each day. But when I step outside my front door and see sandhill cranes preparing for migration, when I see a baby snapping turtle on my driveway or hear the coyotes sing at night, then I remember my responsibility for the relatives who are still here. I also remember my responsibility as a Dakota writer to share what I've learned about the importance of being a good relative and to live each day believing that our actions will make a difference. Even if the world comes to an end tomorrow, we must still plant our seeds today, both literally and as metaphors in the stories we create for the future. As Robin Wall Kimmerer wrote, language is our gift and our responsibility. In our time together at Dream of Wild Health, we learned that seeds are our ancestors and our relatives. They taught us mindfulness, reverence, and taking a long view of our work, 7 generations into the future. When we worked in the gardens, the seeds taught us the language of corn and beans and squash. And when we took care of our seeds, they reconnected us with our own stories, with our ancestors, and they healed the broken places in our families. In my own family, sharing the story of seeds helped heal what had been broken by boarding schools. From a place of deep gratitude and love, I grow them in my own garden, protect them through the winter, and give them voice through my writing. In many ways, writing The Seed Keeper has been my way to give back to the people who have shared so much with me and to help carry this work forward to future generations. By sharing this story, I wanted to celebrate the beauty, brilliance, and joy that comes with reclaiming our relationship with the earth and our more than human relatives. In 2016, when I visited the Standing Rock encampment that opposed the Dakota Access Pipeline, Dakota leaders insisted they were not protesting. Instead, they were protecting the water, our sacred first medicine. They were protecting what they loved. As we face the challenges of this climate crisis, it's more important than ever to remember that we are strongest when we are protecting what we love, rather than living in fear for the future. I believe that our stories can help us find the way back to a loving, spiritually centered relationship with the earth. As Crystal Echohawk has said, if we change the story, we change the future. The challenge for me as a writer was how to turn these teachings, experiences, and idealistic yearnings into a work of fiction. As I began writing and learning this complex craft, I struggled most with developing characters and finding a voice for the book. I looked to other writers for inspiration and practical advice, in particular finding Solar Storms by Linda Hogan to be a powerful example for exploring family and environmental trauma with exquisitely crafted, subtle language. But it wasn't until I developed a writing exercise that explored each character as a first-person voice that I discovered the right form for the book. Even more important, that exercise affirmed that the practice of listening, whether to fictional characters, to seeds and plants, or to other voices in a diverse community, is integral to the writing process and our development as human beings. In March 2021, over 20 years since I first began to volunteer with Indigenous seeds, I launched the Seed Keeper as part of Seed Week, the first ever 5-day celebration that acknowledged the cultural importance of our Indigenous seeds through stories, art, music, gardening, and food. When our small group of Native organizations first started planning, we all agreed that the week needed to begin with Hitunkankampi, the myths and legends about our seeds that have been handed down through many generations and can only be told in winter. We invited traditional storytellers to share Anishinaabe, Dakota, and Lakota stories about the way corn was given to each tribe. While each story was unique, they all shared a common theme. At a time when the people were struggling, their prayers were answered with a sacred gift of corn from a spirit being. Each story conveyed reverence for spirit, called for discipline and commitment to caring for the corn, and offered gratitude for the gift. By opening Seed Week with these traditional stories, our hope was that they would help people remember the ancient teachings about our relationship with seeds, whose gift of food helped people survive. These seeds hold the stories and memory of a relationship with the earth, with plants and animals that dates back to our earliest ancestors. The second night of Seed Week presented contemporary storytellers who shared stories or wicho oyake of the more recent past that help us process and understand our history. On that night, I introduced the Seed Keeper with the hope that this story would remind us of the responsibility that comes with the gift of seeds. The book was inspired by a true story that had been silenced for many years. It's a story that was never written down, to my knowledge, or recorded in history books. I have no facts to prove it, nothing except the continued survival of the corn itself and a few fragments of family stories. Yet I continue to call it a true story because it aligns with my historical research, my understanding of community, and resonates with my intuitive knowledge. In 2002, I participated in the first ever Dakota commemorative march to honor the 1,700 Dakota women, children, and elders who were forcibly removed from Minnesota after the 1862 war. This is another example of a story that has been omitted from the history books. One of the marchers told me that the Dakota women had no idea where they were being sent or how they would feed their families, so they sewed their seeds into the hems of their skirts and hid them in their pockets. Even when families were starving, these women protected their seeds for the coming season and for future generations. Thanks to their courage and sacrifice, we still have Dakota corn to grow today. Their actions offer a profound lesson in how to protect what we love for future generations, as well as demonstrating the immense transformative power embedded in a single story. It's very dry in here. So the Seed Keeper is told through the voices of 4 Dakota women across several generations from 1862 to 2002. And rather than limiting the story to a single narrator as I had first intended, this form allowed me to share different perspectives across multiple time periods. Each character carries specific history, events, and relationships that help develop the themes of the story. I need a chair. thank you very much. Yeah, thank you very much. I just need to sit for a second. Of course, then you can't see me. Okay, we'll carry on. Sorry about the blocked view. Sometimes when I stand for a long time, it gets very dry, and I just have to sit. So we're just gonna do it this way. We're close to the end, but I don't wanna skimp. We're getting to the big finish. The question that I ask, can you hear me? Throughout the Seed Keeper is how our relationship with seeds has changed over many generations, and what that change means for us as human beings and for the seeds themselves. Ultimately, the Seed Keeper is a story about protecting what we love, remembering our history, and celebrating the gifts we received from the earth. And I want to read just a single paragraph. It's from the middle of the book, set in 1998, and it's told by Rosalie Ironwing, the main character, and it sums up really the way that I think about seeds. And so it's set at a time when she's learning to garden and she's living on the farm. And this is how she describes seeds. Everywhere I looked, I saw how seeds were holding the world together. They planted forests, covered meadows with wildflowers, sprouted in the cracks of sidewalks, or lay dormant until the long-awaited moment came, signaled by fire or rain or warmth. They filled the produce aisle in grocery stores. Seeds breathed and spoke in a language all their own. Each one was a miniature time capsule, capturing years of stories in its tender flesh. How ignorant I felt compared to the brilliance contained in a single seed. And as you leave here tonight, I hope you'll carry this message with you, that true stories, regardless of genre, offer the gift of discovery, allowing us to explore and evolve as writers, to understand our relationships with each other, as well as our more than human relatives, and ultimately who we hope to become as human beings. Remember that we create the world through the stories we tell, as well as the stories we don't tell. Now, more than ever, the world needs fierce, uncompromising writers to speak up for justice and for the earth. When we invest our passion and intellect in stories that deepen our shared humanity, when we open ourselves to our ancestral connections, when we develop our craft with integrity in a way that celebrates language, then we are truly serving the world with stories that are rooted in truth, stories that are medicine. Pidamaya. Okay, we made it through. I think we're going to do questions, right? Yeah. Yes. So anything you'd like to ask? I am open to any questions. Yes.
Have you found that when you are writing your memoir and telling the stories the way you want them to be told, which alters how they actually happen, that at some point you can no longer know which is the actual story and which is not?
So that's an interesting question. He asked if when writing a memoir and telling the story, does that alter a story in the way that you no longer know entirely which story you're telling and the one you're living? I believe that there is a circle that happens in storytelling and living that story, that they impact each other. That by telling that story, it changes the story. And that and that's something that I've seen in the work that I did in nonprofits, that I was able to live that experience with families and community and then bring that into the stories that I was telling. And by telling stories, then that deepened my understanding of the work I was trying to do, and that fed back into the work. So I do believe it's a circular process of writing and living the experience. Yeah, thank you. Anyone else? I know it's a big group. Yeah.
As an activist, I wonder if you have anything to say about, I've been reading that there's some movement to try to repeal or change the Indian Welfare Act in the Supreme Court.
That's huge. So the question was about ICWA, the Indian Child Welfare Act, that is right now being heard at the Supreme Court. And this is a huge issue for Native communities. If you can imagine, after all those painful years of having your children removed to boarding schools and adopted out into white families, and then finally in 1978, within the lifetime of a number of people in this room, including myself, they finally passed the Indian Child Welfare Act that prioritizes Native families and tribes as being the first priority for placing children. And instead, now, and it's a painful, painful process to watch. This act is being challenged at the Supreme Court. So even as we sit here tonight, that really important act is undergoing a review in a conservative court. So I'm deeply worried about that.
Do you have any knowledge of what their motivation is? Why?
You know, I've been asking that question since I began reading about boarding schools, and I don't understand it other than from a lens of needing to dominate and using children as a tool to get there. Yeah. Yes.
Hi.
Yes.
I have a question about, like, maybe what challenges did you face when bringing this story together over 4 generations? So from 1862 to 2002, it's a very, very long time, and formulating the story over that many years and kind of coming to this culmination in this book.
Yeah. So the question was the challenges in writing a story that spans across generations from 1862 to 2002. And what I found was that in working with a single narrator, that I was limited in how long of a story that I could tell, that I was going to have to restrict myself to just what Rosalie knew in her lifetime. And so by opening up the form of the novel to include 4 voices, then it actually made it easier in some ways because they could speak directly to their own experience of that time period. It also greatly increased the amount of research that I had to do. So it made it more work in one way, but it was so well worth it to be able to represent that full story of the seeds from that original story that I'd heard and all the way through to 2002. So yes, thank you for that question. Yeah.
What language were you speaking at the beginning?
So I was speaking Dakota language, and I'm a beginner, and that's so, but it's, you know, it's never too late to learn. So yeah, it's a beautiful language. Yeah.
What is the biggest difference between telling story in English and telling story in Dakota language?
So, because I'm a beginner, I can't speak too deeply to the language question, but what I understand is that Dakota language is much more land-based. So it has a different relationship to land than, say, English does. So I wish that I did have that fluency to be able to. I used language throughout my book for specific references that were complex and could be best explained in Dakota, but some point. I think there's more writers moving to that practice of doing books in 2 languages now. Yeah, thank you. Yeah.
Our book group read your book, The Seakeeper, last month, and we all loved it. So thank you so much for such a wonderful, beautiful novel. I'm Catholic, and every week I get begging letters from Indian mission schools. And I'm just wondering, is that something that now respects the culture and the language our kids taught by Native teachers? And is their culture celebrated? Is this something that, I owe the community to support these schools? Or is there still that killing a culture kind of thing? Do you have any sense of what's happening on those schools now?
I think you'd have to look into each individual school experience. But for the most part, my understanding is that they are now run by Native communities. And in terms of the owing question, I think that is a very complicated question about what is owed to Native people for whom have lost not only their homelands, but also in many cases their children, their way of life, their language, their traditions. Whether you choose to make personal reparations to a letter that comes to you, that would be your decision. But in my mind, reparations and reconciliation for Native people is long overdue, and especially with regard to boarding schools. And that my hope is that Deb Holland's work and presence is going to be what finally brings boarding schools up to to a very visible place for American people, because to me, it's shameful that we haven't addressed this history. Yeah.
You mentioned during your talk that you are an avid gardener. So I'm wondering, how has your relationship with your ancestry and your respect for being an agriculturalist changed and adapted throughout your research?
How has my experience as a gardener changed and adapted throughout the research?
Your respect for how nature gives back.
Oh, gardening is just teaching you every day you're out there. Are you a gardener?
I am.
Okay, so you know. But what really changed things for me was going to work at Dream Wild Health. And that's where I learned to pray while I gardened, or pray before I gardened, or pray, to make sure that you don't go into the garden when you're angry or in a bad state of mind, that you approach that work really with reverence, and that those plants who are going to feed us and give their lives for us deserve that kind of respect. Yeah. Yeah, anybody else?
There's one last question.
One last question? There we go.
Your dual languages, how does that affect your use of words, your writing?
So dual languages, how does that affect writing? And again, I'm a beginner, so what I know is what I've learned through just the more introductory levels of language class. So it's not, so it's a practice that I can begin to bring into my writing. I think for me right now, with knowing language, the most impactful piece is being able to introduce myself. And an elder told me once, always introduce yourself in Dakota so that you open with the language and remind people that Minnesota is Dakota homeland. So for me, that's a really important message to convey in speaking Dakota, and just to share that little bit of family history and who I am that comes through the introduction. So yeah, I think, I can't speak beyond that, though, to the language question. But I want to thank all of you for coming and for, being part of this conversation.